What happens when a ruthless billionaire makes a bet to marry a struggling single mother, only to realize he's fallen for her? Ethan Caldwell thought he could control everything, until Sienna Brooks and her children turned his world upside down. Lies, betrayal, redemption, this story has it all. But can love truly be earned after such a cruel game? Stay until the end to find out. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories. Ethan Caldwell never lost, not in business, not in life, and certainly not in a bet. At 38, he had built an empire from nothing. Caldwell Enterprises, a billion-dollar conglomerate spanning finance, real estate, and technology. He had clawed his way to the top, making enemies, crushing competition, and securing his place as one of the most powerful men in the country. Ethan didn't believe in luck. He believed in strategy, in control. Every decision was calculated, every risk managed, every move leading to an inevitable victory. Which was why, when Harrison Wolfe leaned back in his chair with that smug grin, Ethan already knew he was walking into a challenge. It was another Friday night in their exclusive members-only club, a place where deals were made over whiskey and cigars, where men who owned entire industries gambled away fortunes just to feel something. Ethan rarely indulged in their games. He had nothing to prove, but tonight was different. "You always play it safe, Caldwell," Harrison said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You take risks, sure, but only when you already know the outcome." A few chuckles echoed around the table, the other men watching with mild amusement. Ethan leaned back, meeting Harrison's gaze with an icy stare. "I built this empire because I don't gamble," Ethan said smoothly. "I win." Harrison smirked. "Exactly my point. You've never really risked anything, not when it matters." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't react. He had known Harrison for years. Old money, the son of a steel tycoon, born into wealth and privilege. They had been rivals since their Ivy League days, constantly pushing, testing, waiting for the other to slip. "All right," Ethan said, intrigued despite himself. "What are you getting at?" Harrison leaned forward, his grin widening. "A marriage bet." The room went silent for a beat. Then laughter erupted. Ethan let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Marriage isn't a bet," he said. "It's a slow death." "Exactly why it's a challenge," Harrison countered. "You see, you've had it easy, Caldwell. Every woman you've ever been with has fit into your perfect little world. Models, executives, socialites. They know the rules. They play the game. But what if you had to marry someone completely outside of it?" Ethan's smirk faded slightly. "Define outside my world. No CEOs, no wealthy elites, no women who care about your money." Harrison's eyes gleamed. "Someone who wouldn't give a damn about who you are," Ethan scoffed. "There's no woman alive who wouldn't care about my wealth." "That's what makes it interesting," Harrison said, pulling out his phone. "And lucky for you, I have the perfect candidate." He turned the screen toward Ethan. The image was of a woman standing in a dimly lit diner, balancing a tray on one arm while a small child clung to her hip. She was young, late 20s maybe, but exhaustion lined her features. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, her uniform slightly wrinkled, her expression one of someone too tired to dream anymore. "Sienna Brooks," Harrison said, 29, single mother of 3, working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. No connections, no money, no way out. He smirked. She's the opposite of everything you know. Someone at the table whistled. Another shook his head. She'd never say yes, one of the men said. Ethan barely heard them. He was still looking at the photo. She was struggling, that much was obvious, but there was something else in her eyes. Something defiant, something unbroken. He wasn't sure why, but it made him pause. Year, Harrison said, sensing the hook was in. Marry her, live with her, play the role of husband and father. If you last 12 months, you win. Ethan leaned back, considering. And, in return, Harrison pulled out a sleek black folder and placed it on the table. Control of Wolf Industries' West Coast assets. Silence. Ethan's expression didn't change, but inside he felt the sharp pull of opportunity. Those assets were worth billions. More importantly, they would give him a foothold in a sector he'd been locked out of for years. For the first time, the bet wasn't just about proving a point. It was about power. He met Harrison's gaze, his mind already calculating every angle, every risk. This is insane, someone muttered. Ethan ignored them. All right, he said, setting his glass down. I'll do it. Laughter, cheers, and murmurs of disbelief erupted around the table. Bets were already being placed on how long he would last. Harrison grinned. Then I suggest you go find yourself a wife. As the night continued, Ethan sat back, letting the weight of his decision settle in. He didn't know Sienna Brooks. He didn't know her life, her struggles, or what it would take to make her agree. But none of that mattered, because Ethan Caldwell never lost. And he wasn't about to start now. Sienna Brooks had long since stopped believing in miracles. At 29, she had seen enough of life's cruelty to know that happy endings weren't meant for people like her. Dreams were for those who had the luxury to chase them. She had no such luxury, not when she was barely keeping her head above water, working 2 jobs, stretching every dollar until it bled, and doing everything in her power to give her kids a life that wasn't defined by struggle. Tonight was no different. The neon sign outside Joe's diner flickered, casting a sickly glow over the parking lot as Sienna balanced a tray on one hand and wiped a spill off the counter with the other. The place smelled like burnt coffee and fried food, and the air buzzed with the low hum of conversation. It was a slow night, which meant fewer tips, which meant another week of figuring out how to make rent with money she didn't have. The bell above the door jingled. She barely glanced up, already moving to grab the pot of coffee. Booth or counter? She asked, voice flat, exhausted. Silence. Something about the lack of response made her look up, and the sight nearly knocked the breath out of her. The man standing in front of her didn't belong in a place like this, not with that perfectly tailored suit, sharp jawline, and eyes so cold they could freeze fire. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that made the room feel smaller. People were already staring, whispering, wondering why a man like him had walked into a diner like this. He watched her, gaze calculating. Sienna Brooks? Her stomach tightened. People like him didn't come looking for people like her. Nothing good ever came from being noticed by men in suits. "Who's asking?" she said, crossing her arms, shielding herself with instinct. He didn't blink. Ethan Caldwell. The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it, like she should know who he was, sent a chill through her. She gripped the coffee pot a little tighter. "I don't have time for games, Mr. Caldwell," she said, already turning back to her work. "I have a business proposition for you." Sienna let out a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, well, unless it comes with a paycheck, I'm not interested. Ethan didn't move. It does. That made her pause. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze again, and for the first time, she really looked at him. He wasn't just rich. He was dangerous. Not in a physical way, but in the way power radiated off him, in the way he stood like he owned the ground beneath his feet. I'm offering you $1 million, he said, his voice smooth, even, to marry me. For 1 year. Silence crashed over the diner. She blinked, sure she had misheard. The words sounded like something out of a movie, ridiculous and impossible. Then she laughed, shaking her head. You're insane. I assure you, I'm not. He said it like it was the most rational thing in the world, like this was just another business deal. Sienna put a hand on her hip, trying to ignore the unease curling in her stomach. So, let me get this straight. You just walked in here, found some random waitress, and decided to buy yourself a wife? Not random, Ethan said, slipping his hands into his pockets. I chose you. A shiver crawled down her spine. And why exactly would you do that? Ethan's expression didn't change. That's not relevant. Sienna scoffed. It is to me. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether she was worth the full truth. Then he exhaled, long and slow. I need a wife for a year, he said. You need financial security. It's a simple exchange. At the end of 12 months, you walk away with the money, no strings attached. No strings attached. Liar, there was always a catch. She crossed her arms tighter, hoping he couldn't see the way her fingers trembled. And what exactly do you get out of this? Ethan's lips curved, not a smile, more like the ghost of one. That's not something you need to worry about. Right. Because nothing about this situation was suspicious at all. She should have told him to go to hell. She should have walked away. But the problem was, $1 million wasn't just a number to her. It was security. It was food on the table. It was a future for her kids. Still, she forced herself to shake her head. I don't know you, and I sure as hell don't trust you. You don't have to, Ethan said smoothly. You only have to agree. Something in his tone made her stomach twist. He wasn't asking, he was offering her a deal, and deals with men like him weren't just about money. I'll give you a day, he said, glancing at his watch. Tomorrow night, same time. I'll be back for your answer. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving her standing there with her pulse hammering in her throat. That night she barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the cracks in her ceiling, listening to the sound of her youngest, Lily, breathing softly beside her. Across the room, her boys, Lucas and Ben, shifted in their sleep on the mattress they shared. Rent was due in 5 days. The fridge was half empty. Her ex-husband's debt collectors were still circling like vultures. $1 million. She had spent years fighting for every scrap of stability, for every inch of survival. And now, a stranger in a suit had walked into her life and offered her a way out. But at what cost? By the time the sun rose, she already knew her answer. The next night, at exactly the same time, Ethan Caldwell walked back into Joe's diner, looking as cold and untouchable as he had the night before. Sienna was already waiting. I'll do it, she said, voice steady. Something flickered in his expression. Approval, maybe? Or something else she couldn't name. But let's get one thing straight, she continued. I'm not some trophy wife for you to parade around. I'm doing this for my kids, not for you. Ethan's lips barely moved. Understood. But as she reached out and shook his hand, a nagging feeling settled in her gut. She had just made a deal with the devil, and she had no idea what it was going to cost her. Sienna stood outside her apartment, gripping her children's hands as a sleek, black SUV pulled up in front of their crumbling building. The contrast was almost laughable. The towering luxury vehicle against the backdrop of peeling paint, rusted stair rails, and windows covered with old blankets instead of curtains. It was a reminder that she was stepping into a world that wasn't hers, one where men like Ethan Caldwell dictated the rules. Her oldest, Lucas, shifted beside her, his face carefully blank, but she could feel the tension radiating off him. He was 13, old enough to understand that this wasn't normal, that his mother agreeing to marry a stranger overnight wasn't something people just did. "This is a bad idea," he muttered under his breath. Sienna squeezed his hand, her heart twisting. "I know." Then the driver stepped out, a man in a crisp black suit with an unreadable expression. He opened the back door and nodded. "Mrs. Caldwell." Sienna flinched. The title felt wrong, like a lie. Her youngest, Lily, tugged on her sleeve. "Is this our new car?" she whispered, eyes wide with wonder. Sienna forced a smile. "For now." The kids climbed in first, Lily bouncing excitedly on the plush leather seats, while Ben, her quiet middle child, sat stiffly, glancing around like he expected someone to throw them out. Lucas, ever skeptical, folded his arms and glared out the window. As the car pulled away, Sienna looked back at the apartment building, her chest tightening. It wasn't much. Hell, it had barely been livable. But it had been theirs. Now, she didn't know what awaited them. The drive was long, taking them out of the familiar cramped streets of their neighborhood and into the heart of wealth. As the landscape changed from run-down storefronts to glittering high-rises, Sienna felt the weight of what she had agreed to. Then they arrived. The Caldwell estate wasn't just a house. It was a statement, a mansion built not for comfort but for power. The driveway stretched so long she couldn't even see the road anymore, flanked by towering iron gates and pristine landscaping. The building itself was a fortress of glass and steel, modern and cold. Lucas let out a low whistle. Jesus! Ben, who rarely spoke unless it mattered, mumbled, "It's too big." Sienna swallowed hard. "It's not ours." Before she could say anything, the front door opened, and there he was. Ethan Caldwell stood at the entrance, dressed in another one of his immaculate suits, his posture impossibly straight. His expression was unreadable, but his sharp blue eyes swept over them with a calculating gaze. "You're late," he said. Sienna stiffened. By 5 minutes. Punctuality matters. It took everything in her not to roll her eyes. Of course he cared about something as ridiculous as that. He didn't wait for her response, simply turned on his heel and walked inside, expecting her to follow. Lucas muttered, "I already hate him." Sienna sighed, but didn't argue. Instead, she took Lily's hand and stepped into the mansion, the cool air of the foyer swallowing them whole. The place was just as intimidating on the inside as it was on the outside. Marble floors that echoed with every step, a grand staircase that looked straight out of a palace. Walls lined with expensive art that probably cost more than everything she'd ever owned in her life. A woman in a crisp black uniform approached. "I'm Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper. If you need anything, let me know." Sienna just stared. A housekeeper? She'd spent the last few years cleaning other people's homes, and now someone was offering to clean hers? The kids, meanwhile, were frozen, staring at their new reality with wide eyes. Lily broke the silence first. "Where's our room?" Ethan gestured to the staircase. "Mrs. Holloway will show you." Ben hesitated before following while Lily grabbed Lucas's hand and pulled him along. Her oldest barely moved, his gaze locked on Ethan, his jaw tight. The moment the kids were out of sight, Sienna exhaled and turned to him. "I don't know what you expect from me, but let's make one thing clear. I'm not here to play wife. I'll show up when you need me to, pretend when necessary, but that's it." Ethan didn't so much as blink. "Noted." She waited for him to say something else, but he didn't. He just turned and walked away. Sienna let out a slow breath. She'd known this wasn't going to be easy. She just hadn't expected it to feel this impossible. That night dinner was awkward. The massive dining table was long enough to seat 20 people, but only 6 chairs were occupied. The kids sat on one side, whispering amongst themselves, their voices hesitant. Ethan sat at the head, silent as ever, eating with the same meticulous precision that he seemed to apply to everything. The tension was suffocating. Then Lily, bless her tiny innocent heart, spoke up. "Do you have a dog?" Ethan didn't look up. "No," Lily frowned. "Why not?" "I don't like Miss." Lucas muttered. "That explains a lot." Ethan's gaze flicked to him, but he didn't engage. Sienna pinched the bridge of her nose. "Eat your food, Lucas." He scowled but obeyed. Then disaster struck. Ben reached for his glass of water, but his elbow knocked it over, the liquid spilling across the pristine tablecloth. Sienna tensed, already reaching for napkins. Before she could finish, Ethan snapped his fingers, and within seconds, a staff member appeared, swiftly cleaning up the mess as if it had never happened. Ben's face burned red. He ducked his head, shoulders stiff, ashamed. Sienna's chest ached. In their old apartment, spills were normal, accidents were expected, but here, in Ethan Caldwell's world, there was no room for mistakes. She set down her fork. "Thank you," she said, her voice sharp, controlled. Ethan met her gaze, something unreadable in his expression. For the rest of the meal, no one spoke. Later that night, Sienna tucked Lily into bed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. She glanced at Lucas, who sat on the edge of his bed, arms crossed. "Are we supposed to pretend this is normal?" he asked, voice low. "No," Sienna admitted, "but this is where we live now." "For how long?" She hesitated. "A year." Lucas didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The betrayal was already written all over his face. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Just give it a chance." Lucas scoffed. "I don't trust him." Sienna looked away. "Neither do I." She left the room before he could say anything else, closing the door softly behind her. But as she stood in the hallway, staring at the unfamiliar surroundings of her new life, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a mistake. That marrying Ethan Caldwell wasn't just about money. That somehow, some way, she had just stepped into something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The first week in the Caldwell estate was nothing short of a disaster. Sienna had expected challenges, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of living under the same roof as Ethan Caldwell. He was cold, rigid, and entirely detached from the world she and her children had come from. The mansion, though lavish, felt more like a museum. Beautiful but lifeless, full of things they weren't supposed to touch, rules they weren't supposed to break. And then there were her kids. Lucas, as expected, hated every second of it. He spoke in clipped tones, avoided Ethan at all costs, and spent most of his time with his headphones in, trying to pretend none of this was real. Ben was quiet, too quiet, and Lily, well, Lily seemed to be the only one who didn't feel out of place. She ran through the halls like they were hers, touching everything, asking endless questions, and ignoring every ounce of tension. Sienna, meanwhile, spent most of her time trying to avoid Ethan. But avoiding Ethan Caldwell was impossible. Every morning he was up before sunrise, already dressed, already working. He lived his life on a strict schedule, and the intrusion of an unstructured family into his carefully managed world clearly grated on him. He never said it outright, but Sienna could feel it. The impatience when Lily's giggles filled the halls, the slight frown when Ben hesitated before answering a question, the cold indifference when Lucas barely acknowledged his presence. She didn't care. She wasn't here to make him comfortable. But that didn't mean the tension wasn't exhausting. Then, on the 7th day, everything imploded. It was early evening when Sienna heard the commotion. She was in the kitchen, trying to figure out how to use the state-of-the-art coffee machine that was somehow more complicated than her entire life, when a crash echoed through the house. She froze. A second later, a deep, sharp voice cut through the air. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Sienna didn't hesitate. She sprinted down the hallway, following the sound until she reached the garage. Ethan stood near the entrance, his expression a mask of ice. His posture was rigid, hands curled into fists at his sides. And across from him, standing near a workbench, was Lucas. Her son's jaw was tight, his shoulders squared in defiance, but there was something wary in his stance, a tension that sent every maternal instinct inside Sienna into overdrive. "What's going on?" she demanded. Ethan didn't look at her. His eyes remained locked on Lucas. "I found him in here," he said, "digging through my things." Lucas scoffed. "I wasn't digging through anything." Ethan took a slow, measured step forward. "This garage is off limits." "Maybe put up a sign," Lucas shot back. Sienna stepped between them. "Lucas, go to your room." Her son's eyes flashed. "I didn't do anything wrong." She didn't argue. She simply stared at him, her silent way of telling him this wasn't the time to fight. Lucas clenched his jaw, but after a long pause, he spun on his heel and stalked past her, shoving his hands deep into his pockets. When he was gone, Sienna exhaled and turned back to Ethan. "That was unnecessary." His brows lifted. "Was it?" "Yes," she snapped. "He's 13. He wasn't trying to rob you." "This isn't about theft," Ethan said, his voice calm, controlled, but laced with something sharper beneath the surface. "It's about rules. Boundaries." Sienna let out a harsh laugh. "Rules? That's what this is about?" Ethan took a step closer, his presence looming. "I run my life a certain way, Sienna. This house has order, structure. You and your children are guests here. And I expect you to follow the rules." "Guests." The word was like a slap. "Right," she said, forcing out a bitter chuckle. "Of course. Because that's what we are to you, isn't it? Just an inconvenience you have to tolerate for a year." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't have to. His silence said everything. Sienna swallowed the lump in her throat, hating the sting in her chest. She had known this was a transaction. She had agreed to it. But standing here, feeling like an intruder in the very place she was supposed to call home for the next 12 months, she realized something. She had made a mistake. She had walked into this thinking she could handle it, thinking she could survive a year of pretending, of keeping her head down, of ignoring Ethan and whatever chaos his world would bring. But she hadn't accounted for this, for how suffocating it felt to exist in a space that wasn't meant for her, for how much her son resented her for putting him here, for how, despite everything, a small, dangerous part of her kept noticing Ethan in ways she shouldn't. She turned away, gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles ached. "Don't talk to my son like that again," she said, her voice low but firm. Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Then keep him out of places he doesn't belong." Sienna didn't look back. She just walked away. But that night, as she lay in a bed that was too big, in a house that was too cold, she stared at the ceiling and asked herself the question she had been avoiding since the day she said yes. How the hell was she going to survive this? The next morning, Ethan did something he hadn't planned. He stayed home. He had woken up early, dressed for work, reached for his keys, and then stopped. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like leaving. Instead, he found himself standing in the living room, watching as chaos unfolded around him. Naomi, the middle child, was arguing with Ben over something neither of them seemed willing to explain. Lily had somehow managed to climb onto the couch and was now bouncing dangerously close to the edge. And Lucas was sitting on the floor, tying his shoes, glaring at the world like it had personally wronged him. Ethan didn't belong here. But for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to leave. Then Sienna walked in. She froze when she saw him, her body tensing automatically. "You're still here?" she asked, suspicion laced in every word. Ethan adjusted his watch. Apparently, Sienna eyed him like he had just announced he was running for president. "Well, don't just stand there," she said, waving vaguely. "You're making the air weird." Ethan arched a brow. "I'm making the air weird?" "Yeah." He huffed out a quiet laugh. Then, before he could stop himself, he rolled up his sleeves and moved toward the kitchen. Sienna watched him with narrowed eyes. "What are you doing?" "Making coffee." She blinked. "You know how to do that?" Ethan smirked. "I built a billion-dollar company. I think I can manage a coffee machine." He couldn't. 10 minutes later, Sienna was doubled over in laughter, as Ethan scowled at the disaster in front of him. "What is this?" he muttered, staring at the coffee that looked more like tar. Sienna wiped at her eyes. "I don't know, but I think it's alive." For the first time since this whole thing started, something shifted. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, and neither of them quite knew what to do about it. The change happened slowly. It wasn't something Ethan planned or even noticed at first. It was in the way Sienna's kids filled the once empty house with noise, the way Lily's giggles echoed down the halls, the way Ben asked too many questions, the way Lucas, despite his hatred for Ethan, never backed down from a challenge. It was in the way Sienna moved through the house as if she didn't care whether she belonged or not. She didn't tiptoe, she didn't shrink. She existed with the same quiet defiance she had the first night he met her. And maybe that was the problem, because somewhere along the way she stopped being just a deal. And he didn't know how to handle that. Sienna had no idea what to do with Ethan Caldwell. One minute, he was an unshakable force of arrogance. The next, he was standing in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, looking like he regretted every life decision that had led to him attempting to make pancakes for her kids. It wasn't a trick. She'd watched him. He wasn't performing, wasn't trying to win them over with grand gestures or fake smiles. He was just there. And that was what terrified her the most. because it made forgetting the truth harder. It made pretending that this arrangement was just about money feel impossible, which was why she should have seen it coming. The betrayal, the crash, the reality slamming back into her like a fist to the ribs. But she didn't, and that was her first mistake. The grocery store was crowded, the aisles packed with impatient customers, and the scent of stale air conditioning. Sienna had barely managed to squeeze in a shopping trip between picking up Lily from school and making sure Lucas didn't kill his math tutor. She wasn't paying attention when she passed them, two women standing near the bakery, whispering. Not until she heard Ethan's name. Her heart stuttered. She slowed, pretending to examine a box of cereal she couldn't afford before the marriage. "I still can't believe it," one of them said, laughing under her breath. Ethan Caldwell. Married to her. "Did you hear why?" the other whispered. Sienna gripped the box tighter. "It was a bet," the first woman continued, voice dripping with amusement. "Apparently, Harrison Wolfe challenged him to marry the most unfit woman possible, someone completely outside his world. If he lasts a year, he wins some massive deal." The second woman gasped. "Wait, she doesn't know?" The first shrugged. "Probably not. But honestly, would it even matter? I mean, she was broke. If a billionaire offered me $1 million, I'd play wife for a year too." They laughed. Sienna couldn't breathe. The box of cereal slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. She didn't stop to pick it up. She turned and walked straight out of the store, her pulse roaring in her ears. The drive home was a blur. The walls of the Caldwell estate, once just cold and unfamiliar, now felt suffocating. Every inch of it reeked of something she hadn't seen before. A game. A lie. She stormed through the front doors, barely registering Lily calling out to her from the couch. Ethan was in his office. She didn't knock. She didn't care. She slammed the door behind her, sending framed photos rattling against the wall. Ethan looked up, his brows furrowing. "Sienna?" She didn't speak. Not at first. She just stood there, hands shaking, breath uneven. Then, finally, she said, "Tell me the truth." Ethan's expression flickered. Just for a second. So quick that if she hadn't been watching, she might have missed it. But she was watching, and she saw the guilt, the confirmation. Her stomach twisted. "Oh my God," she whispered. Ethan exhaled, setting his pen down. "Sienna, don't," her voice shook. "Don't you dare try to talk your way out of this." He hesitated, his jaw tightened. "It's not what you think," he said. She laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "Really? Because I think you made a bet with your rich little friends about whether or not you could marry me." Silence. Sienna's nails dug into her palms. "I think you turned me and my kids into a goddamn wager." Ethan didn't deny it, didn't try to lie, and that was what made it worse. She felt sick. Sick that she had trusted him, even for a second. Sick that she had started to believe, just slightly, that maybe he wasn't as heartless as he seemed. "You made me think—" She stopped, swallowing hard. Ethan stood. "Sienna, listen to me." "I don't want to listen to you." She shook her head, voice raw. "I want to get out of this house." Ethan's expression darkened. "Sienna." She moved toward the door. He stepped in front of her. "Move." He didn't. "Sienna. Move." For the first time in his life, Ethan hesitated. Then, finally, he stepped aside. Sienna didn't look back. She walked out, heart hammering, hands shaking. She packed their bags. She got her kids in the car, and she laughed, because Ethan Caldwell had lied, and she wasn't going to let him hurt them again. The house was quiet. For the first time since Sienna and her kids had moved in, there was nothing. No laughter, no footsteps, no chaos. Just silence. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the empty space where she had stood, his hands still curled into fists at his sides. He should have known this was coming. He should have known that if she ever found out the truth, she would leave. But that didn't stop the ache in his chest. Because for the first time in his life, he had lost something he actually cared about. And he had no one to blame but himself. Ethan had never known silence could be this loud. It filled the halls of the Caldwell estate, stretching through the cavernous rooms like a ghost of something that had once been alive. No laughter, no running footsteps, no irritated sighs from Sienna as she picked up after the kids. They were gone, and for the first time in his life, Ethan felt the weight of what that actually meant. He had lost business deals before. He had made mistakes, miscalculations, but they had always been fixable. This wasn't, because for the first time he had lost something that wasn't about numbers or contracts. He had lost them. He had lost her, and he wasn't sure how to fix it. Sienna had done a lot of difficult things in her life. Leaving Ethan Caldwell behind shouldn't have been one of them. And yet, as she sat in the tiny motel room with her kids curled up on the two beds, their breathing soft in sleep, she felt hollow. She should have felt relief. She had gotten out before it was too late. She had walked away from the lie, the bet, the humiliation. And yet, her fingers curled into the thin blanket on her lap. She hated that a part of her still ached. She hated that she had let herself feel something for him. But most of all, she hated that she had been stupid enough to think Ethan Caldwell could have been anything more than what he was. A man who only saw the world in terms of what could be won and lost. She exhaled, pressing her palms over her eyes. It didn't matter anymore. They were gone, and there was no going back. Ethan had never struggled to focus before. Business was his lifeline, his foundation. It was where he thrived, where he felt most in control. And yet for the first time in his career, he couldn't concentrate. He sat in his office, staring at spreadsheets and contracts, and all he could see was the look on Sienna's face when she had learned the truth. The way her voice had broken. The way she had looked at him like she hated him. And he deserved it. He had known, the second she walked out, that there was no quick fix. No easy way to bring her back. And for the first time in his life, Ethan realized he didn't care about winning. Not if it meant nothing. Not if it meant losing her. So he did the only thing he could. He started making things right. Not with words, with actions. It started with a single phone call. Then another. Then an entire plan set into motion. Ethan had never looked back before. He had always believed that the past was irrelevant, just another variable in a calculation that led to success. But now, he went back to where Sienna had come from, to the places she had struggled in. And for the first time, he listened. He learned about the factory that had shut down, the one she had worked at before she was forced into minimum-wage jobs, the one he had been responsible for closing. It had been a decision on a balance sheet, a way to cut costs, increase profits. But now, standing in front of the abandoned building, seeing the shattered windows, the graffiti-covered walls, the empty lot where people had once worked to feed their families, He felt it. The destruction he had left behind. The destruction that had nearly destroyed her. And that was when he made his decision. He couldn't undo the past, but he could fix the future. The first thing Ethan did was sell off part of Caldwell Enterprises. It was the biggest financial decision of his life. But for the first time, money didn't matter. He used the proceeds to reopen the factory, not as a business venture, not as a way to make a profit, but as a community project. He put jobs back into the hands of the people who had lost them. He started funding after-school programs for single mothers. He built something that mattered, and he did it without putting his name on it, because this wasn't about him. It was about her. Sienna heard about it before she ever saw it. At first, she thought it was a joke, a stunt, a last-ditch effort to repair his reputation. But the more she heard, the more she realized it wasn't. Ethan wasn't just throwing money at the problem. He was fixing it not for recognition, not for control, but because he finally understood what mattered. And for the first time since she had walked out, she allowed herself to wonder, maybe Ethan Caldwell wasn't the man she had thought he was. Maybe he was becoming something else. 2 months after she had left, there was a knock at her door. She almost didn't open it. She almost pretended she wasn't home. But something in her chest, something stubborn and restless, made her turn the handle. And there he was, Ethan Caldwell, dressed in something that wasn't a suit for the first time since she had met him. His usual cold, unshakable confidence was gone, and what was left was something raw, something real. Sienna folded her arms. "Why are you here?" Ethan exhaled. "Because I needed you to know that I meant it," he said. She frowned. "Meant what?" His throat bobbed. "That I'm sorry." She stared at him, waiting for the catch. But there was. For the first time, Ethan Caldwell wasn't trying to win. He wasn't trying to negotiate. He was just there. And that was what made her finally say, "Come inside." Sienna hadn't planned on letting him in. She had told herself again and again that Ethan Caldwell was a closed chapter in her life, a mistake she had walked away from. But when she opened that door and saw him standing there, something in her wavered. He didn't look like the man she had married. No suit, no carefully constructed mask of control. Just a man who looked like he had lost something important. And maybe, just maybe, he finally realized what it was. So she stepped aside and let him in. The apartment was small, cramped, a far cry from the sprawling mansion they had left behind. The single couch was worn, the kitchen barely big enough to move in, and the second-hand curtains barely kept out the city lights. But it was hers. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, taking it all in. Sienna crossed her arms. "Say whatever you came to say." He turned to face her, hands in his pockets. "I didn't come to talk." She narrowed her eyes. "Then why are you here?" His jaw flexed. "Because I wanted to see you." Her stomach twisted. She hated that his voice still had that effect on her. Hated that after everything, her heart still stumbled when he looked at her like that. Like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to anymore. She exhaled sharply. "Ethan, I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly. She froze. "I don't expect anything," he continued, watching her carefully. "I just needed you to know that I meant what I said. I didn't change because I thought it would bring you back. I changed because I needed to." Sienna swallowed hard. "You're still a billionaire," she said, as if it meant something, as if it changed something. Ethan nodded. Yeah, but for the first time, I don't care about that. She let out a humorless laugh. Since when? He tilted his head. Since you left? The air between them was thick, unspoken words hanging there like ghosts. Sienna shook her head. Ethan, I don't know if I can trust you again. He didn't flinch. Didn't try to convince her otherwise. He just nodded. I know. And that, more than anything, made her chest ache. Because the old Ethan Caldwell would have fought, would have tried to bend her to his will, would have found a way to win. But this man was willing to lose, and that terrified her more than anything. The first time Ethan saw the kids again, it was awkward. Lucas refused to acknowledge him. Ben barely spoke, and Lily, sweet, innocent Lily, hesitated, her little brow furrowed in confusion. You were gone, she said simply, staring up at him. Ethan crouched down, meeting her at eye level. I know. Lily bit her lip. Are you going to leave again? His throat felt tight. He shook his head. No, kiddo, not this time. She studied him for a long moment. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. Okay. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But Lucas wasn't so forgiving. He stood with his arms crossed, jaw clenched. Ethan met his gaze. I don't expect you to believe me. Lucas scoffed. Good, because I'd. Silence. Then, finally, Ethan said, I'm not leaving. Lucas's eyes darkened. Yeah, and how long before you decide this isn't worth it? Ethan didn't answer right away, because the truth was, the old him would have walked away by now. But that man didn't exist anymore. So he simply said, as long as it takes. Lucas didn't respond. But for the first time, he didn't walk away either. Sienna watched it all happen from the sidelines. She watched Ethan show up, day after day, without expecting anything in return. She watched as he helped Ben with his math homework, as he answered Naomi's endless questions with quiet patience, as he carried a half-asleep Lily to bed without a second thought. She watched as Lucas fought him at every turn, and yet Ethan never once lashed out, never once snapped. She waited for him to fail, waited for him to prove that this was all just another game, but he never did. Instead, he just kept showing up, until one evening, she did something she hadn't planned. She invited him to stay for dinner. It was a small thing, but it was also everything, because it meant she was willing to try. And for Ethan Caldwell, that was more valuable than any business deal he had ever made. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Sienna found Ethan on the small balcony of her apartment, staring out at the city lights. She hesitated in the doorway before stepping outside. You don't have to keep doing this, she said softly. Ethan's jaw tensed. Doing what? She sighed. Trying to make up for what you did. Trying to prove something. He turned to look at her. I'm not trying to prove anything. She folded her arms. Then why are you still here? A muscle in his jaw twitched. Because I don't know how to not be. Her breath hitched. She wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she didn't. She just stood there, the cool night air wrapping around them, the weight of something unfinished pressing in. Then Ethan said, I'm leaving the city. Her stomach dropped. What? He exhaled. I'm selling my penthouse. Getting rid of what's left of my old life. She stared at him. Why? His gaze softened. Because it doesn't mean anything to me anymore." Sienna felt her heartbeat in her throat. She turned back to the city lights, trying to steady herself. "And what does?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause. Then, quietly, he said, "This." Her fingers curled around the railing. She should have pushed him away. Should have told him that it wasn't enough. But the problem was, for the first time, she believed him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Sienna never thought she'd get to this point. For weeks, she had watched Ethan show up. Not because he had something to gain, but because he wanted to. He didn't push. He didn't demand. He simply was. And that, more than anything, terrified her. Because for the first time in a long time, she wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a mistake. But trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. It took time, and Ethan Caldwell was willing to give her all the time she needed. It started small. He came over more often, not because she asked him to, but because the kids did. Lily dragged him into her world like he had always belonged there, chattering about cartoons and school and the latest adventure she had planned for her stuffed animals. Ben, quiet, observant Ben, started coming to him for help with his homework, asking questions he wouldn't even ask Sienna. And Lucas? Lucas still held his walls up like armor, but there were cracks in them now. Ethan noticed the way the teenager watched him when he thought no one was looking, the way his scowl wasn't quite as sharp as before. The first time Lucas willingly spoke to him, it wasn't much. Just a single sentence, but it was enough. "You're different," the boy muttered one night, leaning against the doorway while Ethan helped Ben with his science project. Ethan glanced up. "What?" Lucas folded his arms. "You're different," he repeated, frowning like he wasn't sure what to do with the realization. "Not like before." Ethan didn't smile, didn't acknowledge the small victory. He just nodded. "Yeah, I know." Lucas studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, "Good." And that was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Sienna wasn't sure when things shifted between her and Ethan. Maybe it was the way he stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, trying to make pancakes for the kids, even though he sucked at it. Maybe it was the way he sat with Lily on the couch, listening to her talk about school with genuine interest. Maybe it was the way he was just there, a quiet, steady presence she hadn't realized she needed. Or maybe it was the way he looked at her, like she was important, like she mattered. She wasn't sure when it happened. All she knew was that one evening when she turned to say something to him, she forgot what it was. Because Ethan was already watching her, and the look in his eyes, soft, unguarded, stole the breath from her lungs. The proposal wasn't grand. There was no over-the-top gesture, no elaborate speech, just the two of them, sitting on the porch of her apartment, the crickets singing in the background. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulled out a simple ring, and held it out to her. "I don't want to make another deal with you," he said quietly. Sienna swallowed hard. "I don't want to buy my way into your life," he continued. "I just want you and the kids forever." Her chest tightened. She should have been terrified. But for once, she wasn't, because this wasn't a trick. It wasn't a lie. It was real. She looked at him, heart pounding. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Yes," Ethan exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath. Then, carefully, he slid the ring onto her finger. And for the first time in a long time, Sienna felt like she had finally come home. Their wedding wasn't like the first. This time, it wasn't a contract. It wasn't an agreement. It was a promise. The kids were there, dressed up in outfits that didn't quite match, their excitement filling the air. Lily held the flowers, grinning as she scattered petals down the aisle. Lucas stood beside Sienna, hands shoved into his pockets, pretending like he wasn't emotional. Ben whispered to Naomi about how weird it was seeing their mom in a dress. And Ethan couldn't take his eyes off Sienna. She had never looked more beautiful. And when she finally stood in front of him, he took her hands and said the words he had never meant more in his life. "I love you." Sienna blinked, lips parting in surprise. He had never said it before. Not once. Not even when they had started over. And yet now, when it mattered most, he said it like it had always been true. Like it had always been waiting for her to hear. Her throat tightened. She exhaled, gripping his hands a little tighter. "I love you too." And just like that, it wasn't a bet anymore. It wasn't a deal. It was real, and neither of them were afraid to hold on to it. 1 year later, Sienna sat in a hospital bed, cradling their newborn baby in her arms. Ethan sat beside her, staring down at the tiny bundle with something close to awe. The kids were outside, waiting to meet their new sibling. And as Sienna looked at Ethan, she smiled. "We did it," she whispered. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Yeah," he murmured. "We did." Their baby let out a small cry, stretching tiny fingers into the air. Ethan reached down, gently running a hand over the newborn's soft skin. Sienna watched him, and in that moment, she knew. They weren't just a family because of circumstance. They were a family because they had chosen each other. And nothing, not a bet, not a past filled with mistakes, could ever change that. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. Life is unpredictable, and sometimes the people we least expect can change us in ways we never imagined. This story wasn't just about love. It was about redemption, trust, and the power of second chances. Ethan and Sienna's journey teaches us that mistakes don't have to define us, that real change isn't about words, it's about actions, and that love, when it's real, isn't bought or bargained for, it's earned. We all carry our own struggles, our own fears, and our own doubts. But if there's one thing to take away from this story, it's that we are not bound by our past. We have the power to rewrite our future, to become more than what we once were. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another one. Your support means everything, and we can't wait to share more incredible stories with you. Until next time, stay inspired, stay hopeful, and never stop believing in the power of change.